We would like to invite Mr. Ruslan Stefanov, Program Director of the Center for Study of Democracy, to introduce the main topic of the panel, present the panelists, and open the discussion.
Thank you so much. Well, good afternoon, everyone. And as Vanya said, hello to everyone in the four corners of the world, whoever might be watching us live and online. We have a lively last panel. I'm really looking forward to it. And I wanted to think of it as some form of blue sky thinking, as some form of a forward-looking, horizon scanning look into what more can we do. You know, if we start from the morning talk, you know, from the opening, I've had the honor and the pleasure of doing 20 years of anti-corruption in the region, and we have also Ambassador Gudrun Steinacker, who will finish this panel, who's also has tremendous deep insights into the region, but also in Russia and for what that's worth. And we've seen tremendous progress. You know, we've still seen examples of success throughout the years. You know, we've seen successes in Croatia, we've seen them in Romania, we've seen them in Bulgaria, we've seen them in even here. You know, the example that I gave. You know, this technical level preparations. The question is that ever since 2016, we've been monitoring corruption victimization, and if we saw quite a rapid decline, so by 50% between 2001 and 2014-16, then after 2016, we seem to be a little bit stuck. I mean, if you look the latest European communications on they're just preparing the next package, anti-corruption package, and this tells you something because this is the next after 2003, so it's almost like the Thessaloniki summit, and now we are repeated. This is something that we really face very critically, and we also have for the first time the US elevating the anti-corruption into their national security strategy. And I meant this when I said it this morning, that after Russia's war in Ukraine, corruption and the weaponization of corruption becomes a security issue for the whole region. So the question is, how do we engage better with civil society? You know, we've seen, and the whole panel, and also our two participants online from Ukraine, and it's great that they'll be joining us because they also show that Ukraine has shown some great resolve. And we think, of course, that part of that came from also from the anti-corruption work, or I at least hope to believe so. But also, if there is any lesson that we can give Ukraine, or that we could take from Ukraine or Moldova or any other countries, including in Europe, it's that anti-corruption is not a final destination. You know, every generation has its monsters to deal with. And of course, building institutions and adapting those institutions long-term and creating the culture of anti-corruption is really important, because we haven't forgotten the 2008 Eurozone crisis, when we saw many big industrial names in Europe actually paying bribes in Greece, so within the EU. So we're very much aware of that. We've also seen all these, you know, progress within the Western Balkans, within the Balkans, you know, and we come from a region that has all the different monitoring experiences and tools. I think we are a living laboratory, and that's why I think it's really important for us to take stock of what has worked, what not, and what we could always kind of induce ourselves to do more, you know, because it's up to us, up to civil society to restart the engine time and again, so that we don't have concentration of power in political or the private sector, so that we don't have state capture. And I very much look forward to the different presentations. Again, I would urge my panelists to be as provocative, as open as possible. We do have quite a time slot. You know, I might have gotten it as an insider, so I might have gotten my way with my colleagues at CEPS here. But I also like to think that it's also because it's a very, very interesting panel, and I'd like us to come up with specific ideas and possible solutions of what more can we do. I mean, all of us here, I've seen people, we had 20 years of experience and in the region, and to wake up in the next days and years, and think of new ideas, it always gets more and more difficult. And now it's my pleasure to turn the floor to our first speaker, and I'm not gonna go into much details, Dirk Lorenz, who is the head of political section of the European Union delegation to Serbia. And the European Union has been a great force for good. And whenever we look at the heat of the moment, the political moment, and we criticize that we might have been slow or that the EU didn't sort things out, I need us to remember that, that the EU has been a critical force for good for Europe, and the European Commission has been leading that. So, Dirk, I would love you to tell us what's your perspective in terms of, and I understand you're bound by, of course, your institution, but if you could also speak about the opportunities that lie ahead of what civil society, the governments of the region, and with the help of the European Commission could do more. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this opportunity to exchange views here today on the panel, but hopefully also with the audience. And indeed, I would like to give my intervention a little bit a positive spin, because I'm sure we will be offered other views as well on this panel, and then we can hopefully engage in an open and frank discussion. To start with, we live in a different world since the 24th of February. We have a completely new geopolitical realities. There's a before and an after. And I don't need to explain to you what this all entails in terms of human suffering caused by Russia's unprovoked and unjustified aggression against Ukraine. Probably it's not appropriate to speak about something positive about these developments, but if there's one thing I should think about, it is the renewed momentum for enlargement. I think we lived a bit in an environment where the EU would pretend we want you, and Serbs and others would pretend they believe us. And I think we are now one step further. We have woke up also in the European Union. Our main challenge will be to give the region a credible enlargement perspective in which both the leadership and also civil society believes, and the society at large. And also, we have extended this now to another part of Europe. I remember very well from my time in Brussels when we discussed Eastern Partnership Summit declarations and language on European perspective. I've never experienced anything more painful in my diplomatic life than that. We were always stuck. And now we have consensus among EU member states that also Ukraine and Moldova have become candidates, and that there's a European perspective for Georgia. That also means that we have to think about enlargement in a bit different terms. It's not only the Western Balkans, there are new kids on the block who enter the game. You should also rethink, I would say, the whole Eastern Partnership idea and look at how we can cooperate even with Central Asia more in the perspective as Russia's influence is going down. And Russia cannot win this war. And this will weaken Russia's position in the Balkans, in Eastern Europe, and in Central Asia. But I'm not here to speak about Central Asia today. What I would like to address is what does it mean also for enlargement policies that this war has been launched. On the one hand, I would like to assure you that enlargement is still about merits. Yes, there is the geopolitical dimension, but I think people are mistaken if they believe that this means, okay, now let's forget about rule of law. It's now only about CFSP alignment, which is super important also for the credibility of the strategic choice of each country, but it's also still about rule of law. And remember, as it stands, enlargement requires unanimity among our member states, in so many steps, intermediate steps. And I can assure you that there are quite many who still focus their attention on rule of law issues, including the fight against corruption. And also, I would argue that we can see in Ukraine that despite war conditions, such fight can happen. I don't want to take too much of that space because we have a participant from Ukraine who will tell us more. You will also all have seen the news of yesterday. I'm not sure if it's good news or bad news. It's good news in the sense that that there have been resignations, that there are investigations, NABU and SAPO are working. On the other hand, of course, it also reveals that there are instances of corruption. And of course, it is challenging in terms of budget and capacities to continue such a fight when you're bombed. But I would also argue that considerable steps have been taken, in particular to ensure consistent, uninterrupted anti-corruption chain from police to prosecution to the court system, and also this has gained renewed momentum with the candidate status, because in the Commission opinion there are also several steps which have been indicated what needs to be done in terms of the reform of the Constitutional Court, for example, and judicial appointments involving the international community in order to strengthen the fight against corruption, which also shows that even at this very early stage of the process for Ukraine, the fight against corruption has been given prominence in the Commission's positions. Now, of course, civil society must play a crucial watchdog role. I think here also we have interesting questions when it comes to civil society in Ukraine, Georgia, and Moldova. Some might feel that if they are too critical and outspoken, they might endanger the European integration of their countries. I don't have the impression that this is the case for Serbian civil society. So maybe here we see already a first difference between the two. But we also hear voices from Ukraine, and we will probably hear it again today. European Union, do not close your eyes for what goes wrong inside Ukraine. And I can assure you, we are not doing it, as I have just tried to outline. One of the elements for our discussion today is what we can do better, how we can learn from each other, exchange of best practices. And I liked it that you said this is basically not a one-way street. It's not just about what Ukraine can learn and civil society in Ukraine can learn from civil society in Serbia. It's perhaps also the other way around. And also when you look at anti-corruption efforts, for example, in Georgia, I think there are lessons to be learned as well, and best practices one could explore. Now, then I looked a bit, and with colleagues we did some research on civil society cooperation on a regional level, and I had the impression that it looks a bit different. When you look at the Eastern Partnership, for example, you have the Eastern Partnership Civil Society Forum with more than 1,000 participating civil society organizations. Or you have the Association Exchange Forum, which is based basically on the association agreement implementation monitoring and concerns Ukraine, Moldova, and Georgia, and brings together experts and practitioners and government officials. Whereas here in Serbia, but correct me if I'm wrong, I think the focus is less on a regional cooperation. It's a bit more, even though there are different elements, it's a bit more on the national level. Maybe because we do have the structured process of the actual negotiation with the clusters and the chapters and the expertise, and a very active national convention on the European Union, for example, with clusters, coordinators, and also even an institutionalized role in decision-making when it comes to the formation of negotiation positions of Serbia, but also the adoption of legislation to implement their acquis. And so that might, on the other hand, be perhaps best practice for Ukraine and Moldova to look at and to establish a similar forum, and then maybe that the different national conventions and the coordinators, in particular also chapter 23, 24, which is sort of part of our discussion today, can work together and exchange best practices. I can also tell you on a very practical level that I just had yesterday a call with my colleagues in headquarters in
It's on your back.
What's the matter?
Yeah, microphone's a little bit tricky.
I'm sorry for that.
It's okay. It happens. Like I try not to move too much.
Thank you for the advice. But you see, this topic makes me move, and there are also always emotions involved, also because I've served 12 years working on the Eastern Partnership. And my last mission to Ukraine was in a military helicopter to Mariupol to discuss how we can upgrade the port infrastructure, and there's no Mariupol anymore. So it's, yeah. The idea I wanted to present is that we have even on a staff working level now launched a discussion in Brussels, in headquarters, how we can support and maybe organize also back-to-back events between Western Balkans and the Eastern Partnership countries, which would also implement one of the main takeaways of December's ministerial on the Eastern Partnership, which indeed had as one of its conclusions that cooperation also with civil society between the Eastern Partnership, Western Balkans, and potentially even Central Asia should be enhanced. So I will stop here, and I will be happy, of course, to engage in the discussion later on. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I would rather go that we first do the whole panel, and then I think we're going to follow up with some questions. But I would ask Dirk to think about later on. You know, is there a space already, or do you think we need to think of ideas about our own European Magnitsky-style action, you know, on corruption? I know we have on human rights, and we'll ask the same thing, and we hope that Daniel Freund, who is doing the closing keynote from the European Parliament, could tell us. But also internally in the EU, do you think we also could get some more tough action on at least precluding European companies from engaging in corruption within the EU and its neighborhood? You know, so that would be interesting in terms of action and follow-up and what we could do. And of course, sanctioning, decoupling from Russia. You know, because essentially Russia has been weaponizing all the business and stuff. So just as a food for thought then for the discussion, I'm sure the others will follow suit. Now it's my pleasure to turn to Milena Jenovai, who is a project manager, rule of law and good governance at the United States Agency for International Development. Milena, USAID was the agency that helped propel this Saudi network back in 2001. And if I can say one thing about USAID and that has been great working with it, is that there has always been a very strong political engagement on the side of the US government. So if the European Commission has been great into doing this massive, wide-ranging change, USAID and the US government has been really good at doing a tipping point kind of interventions. So I very much look forward to your statement about what is it that we could do now more, including can we do something regionally again, like the US used to have some regional initiatives. Is it helpful to do that? And also hear about the great work you're doing already in this and other countries in the region. Milena.
Thank you, Ruslan, and thank you for inviting USAID and me to present here and to share my views of fight against the corruption in Serbia. I think you're right, USAID has been in Serbia for quite a while, and I think the hard lesson that we learned in last decade is that democracies are still fragile, especially the nascent ones. And the fight against corruption, as you rightfully said, it never ends, actually. And as the Ambassador Hill said this morning, it's not unique to Serbia, so it's basically up to us to try to keep up the pace with the corrupt actors and to try to the largest possible extent share our experiences within the region, but also beyond the region. what is happening, we live in interesting times, and not only because of the unfortunate war on the European soil. It's because basically we are seeing decline in democratic institutions, in rule of law, corruption perception index, as one of the panelists mentioned this morning, is on a standstill. Serbia not looking good on that table. So we are basically kind of we are kind of stuck. So that means that we need to rethink how we do things. I want to mention a couple of things. That U.S. Foreign policy is very much relying on fight against corruption. It's very high on the foreign policy agenda. Also, having in mind that international assistance as well as diplomacy are perceived as one of the key elements in fighting against corruption on a global level. So just in past year or so, U.S. government issued a series of various strategic documents that all highlight the importance of fighting corruption, such as U.S. strategy on combating corruption that was followed with USAID anti-corruption policy. That was then followed with a joint regional strategy specifically made for Europe and Eurasia by State Department and USAID. So this all talks about how high the fight against corruption is on US agenda. But these are all documents. And we've heard of several documents throughout this region. Today, the panelists shared their expertise and their experiences from their countries. Serbia is now working on anti-corruption strategy, right? But the point is how you translate that into action, because the strategies are just piece of paper. Unless you put them into action, they don't really mean a lot. In that respect, what does USAID do? As you know, USAID is present in Western Balkan countries, namely, of course, in Serbia, Kosovo, North Macedonia, Bosnia and Herzegovina. Surprisingly, it's not in Montenegro. USAID left Montenegro almost 10 years ago now. I think what is coming from Washington as some sort of a strategic guidance, it reflects on what all we do on country levels. So each of these missions has a significant places significant emphasis on fight against corruption. For example, in Bosnia and Herzegovina, almost half of their portfolio is basically focused on fight against corruption. Their rule of law project, their civil society project, their media project, they are all tailored around fight against corruption. When it comes to Serbia, we chose a bit of a different approach. We chose to do one large contract that is focused on public procurement, and we've heard about public procurement today as well. We chose that sector for obvious reason. It's one of the sectors the most prone to corruption and abuse of power. But we chose a multi-layered approach to that one. So through this project, we work around the public procurement in a holistic way, so to say, from planning phase through implementation, through tendering, through executing the contract, and then through oversight, and unfortunately also through prosecution and adjudication. We also engage with civil society and media, which we all agree, I think, in this room that play a critical role in shedding light in corrupt behavior and, in this case, breaches of public procurement law. As in other countries, I guess, the public procurement law in Serbia, for example, there is nothing wrong with the law. It's a good law, as most laws in Serbia are. It's how the law still enables room to circumvent the law. It still leaves space to perform public procurement under the radar, under the threshold. And despite that, Serbian law is largely in line with the EU directives. And despite EU objections, Serbia did adopt a special law that allows for circumventing the public procurement law when it comes to projects of special importance. And this is the gray area. And this is something where basically we can deal with it only if we have political will, which we can question whether we have or we have not. For now, I was happy to see that a representative from City of Kragujevac was here, because City of Kragujevac will be one of the partners on this project in helping basically local contracting authorities, and Kragujevac being one of them, to better plan their public procurements, to encourage use of joint procurements, to encourage better market research, better technical specifications, so basically entire planning. So this is, I want to say, this is basically our key rule of law and anti-corruption project currently in Serbia. It just started several months ago. It will go on for another 5 years. What we've learned in the past is that usually our longer-term contracts, longer-term projects are bringing better results. They allow more time to see results, to adjust as we go. I think the problem with the topics such as corruption is that corrupt actors are usually one step ahead of us. And we need to find ways to catch them. We need to find ways to adapt and be flexible and be as fast as they are. And this is the only way how we can catch them. So I will stop here so that I don't take too much time.
Thank you. We'll return to that. I think you mentioned also the two important distinctions, and I think we're doing quite a good job in terms of developing technical capacity to try to reduce the lower level corruption. But how do we make those in power accountable, you know, with the special legislation? I mean, even if you have the perfect law, if there is an intent from the very top of the country, there should be there should be an institutional opportunity for response at some point. So I'm thinking, how do we get this this silver bullet? And now I'd like to, but let's think about it, and we'll return to the discussion later on. I'd like to invite our two online participants, starting with Kateryna Ryzhenko, the Deputy Executive Director for Legal Affairs, Transparency International Ukraine, who have been doing a great job in Ukraine. Part of this was, and I didn't mention Dirk's experience in Ukraine, but it's really emotional. I mean, it's very difficult to not talk emotionally about this bloody war. And in a way, I'm thinking, it's even, I remember when in this region, we've all felt like, as civil society, when we work on anti-corruption, you know, is it that sometimes you undermine your national identity? And I would always say it's a resounding no. You know, we as civil society, we need to keep the powerful to account, and that's our job and duty, no matter what. You know, and even if we think, and when we think about our common goal, which is getting a stronger European family together, that means we owe it to us, we owe it to the citizens, we owe it to the future generations, we owe it to our friends and partners in the EU. And it will be very interesting, and I'm sure that this is also happening in Ukraine, even to a great extent, because the country is at war, and actually trying to work on anti-corruption, thinking about what will happen after the war, how you're going to build, because there will be a window of opportunity after the war is over, and I'm sure Ukraine is winning this war. But there will be a window of opportunity when Ukraine can get, I mean, things will get nasty in terms of anti-corruption there too, at some point. You know, as we say, things are moving always in circles, you know, they never repeat, but okay. But I'm thinking that they will have a short opportunity, and I'm really curious to learn and to hear from Kateryna and then Milena. If we have if we have the online, I'd like now to give the floor to Kateryna to share her experience and also what we might learn from the way Ukraine has done. Do we have
Hello, everyone. I hope you can hear me.
We can perfectly well. Thanks, Kateryna, for joining us. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much for having us today. It's a pleasure to participate in this panel, and I'm glad to share some experiences and practices, lessons learned from Ukrainian side. I just want to start that in Ukraine now, especially relevant is the topic of fighting against corruption, and not just because of what Ruslan, you mentioned in the sense of war and window of opportunity and some money coming into the country already and in the future for reconstruction, but also considering our European Union membership desires and our movement towards fulfilling recommendations that we were giving by European Union, and a lot of them actually concerning corruption and fight against corruption. But just to kind of keep this slightly positive note, I would like to underline that Ukraine actually has done a lot of progress within the last 10 or so years when we talk about fight against corruption. Today was already mentioned the Corruption Perception Index that is being published by Transparency International every year. Actually, we're waiting for the next one for 2022. Next Tuesday. But what can I say, that even if we take this type of measurements of how countries are performing in fight against corruption, Ukraine managed to be in 26 of top countries that made the biggest progress within the last 10 years. And sure that we do also notice and experience this type of standstill that already today was mentioned during the panel, that the most of the efforts were put after the Revolution of Dignity in 2014 in Ukraine. The whole anti-corruption system infrastructure was created with investigative bodies, prosecutorial bodies, high anti-corruption court, and many, many more. And they already working and showing results, which is more, I think, important, that even though we live in the state of full-fledged war and bombings of the whole Ukraine, these agencies, they are still working, they're showing results. The hearing in anti-corruption courts are happening. And I think the last cases, I'm not sure if everyone following exactly what is happening with Ukraine, but in the last couple of days, there were several high officials, there were allegations about corruptions towards them. The deputy defense minister and the deputy minister of infrastructure and regional ministry, they were accused of corruption. And I think these situations actually showing that Ukraine system of Ukraine of fighting against corruption that we built through the years till now is working. Because if we talk about 2014 and before it, it's difficult to imagine if there will be anything in public view about such huge cases as we hear the last couple of days. But today we not only hear about these cases in the media, there is already reaction by investigative bodies. There are already hearings in anti-corruption court about preventive measures concerning people against whom these allegations were made. And it's definitely progress, in my opinion. And it demonstrates that not only low-level corruption is being addressed, but also, for example, defense sector, where these recent allegations, they concern defense sector, they also being addressed both by the media, by proper agencies, state agencies, agencies, by the president and top officials. This is a good sign of transparency and the movement towards strengthening the oversight of how the agencies and top officials work. Of course, in the recent cases, we still should wait till the final decisions of the courts and see if these allegations will stand and there will be verdicts. But the signs, in our opinion, are positive. I would like also to mention another important issue that slightly was already touched by the speakers today, is that we are, as a country, facing a huge challenge when it comes to reconstruction, and the numbers already calculating needed to reconstruct the both residential, non-residential sector and infrastructure. Those are over hundreds of billions of dollars. And obviously, this influx of money into the country that is already happening and hopefully will happen in the future, this money poses a lot of risks, corruption risks. And from the good side, as I mentioned, we already have established infrastructure and established relevant legislation to some degree. And it shows, these things are showing that we can manage future possible corruption risks. But obviously, this is a game changer, the war in Ukraine. And if, as the previous speakers mentioned, if we can take something positive of this destruction and of this war happening in my country, I think it can be that finally there is enough incentive and enough of a push to, as a game changer for both anti-corruption efforts, but also sanction policy, as it was also mentioned today, when it comes to the corruption crimes all around the world. And we already see the movements in this direction. Finally, we see that there is movements towards governments in all European countries and outside of Europe, finding this political will and maybe necessary enthusiasm to review and reform existing mechanisms that obviously were not prepared for this situations and for this amount of sanctions that are needed to be imposed. But now it is very important to not lose this momentum, and we are very very considerate of that Ukraine won't be hot topic for forever, even if the war drags out. So I think it is important for European countries and for Ukraine and our neighbors to use this momentum to push for a change. Because even though, for example, now we have the sanctioned regimes and there is hundreds and or even thousands of people falling under the sanctions, there is still a huge hole in how the sanctions how to make them into, for example, confiscations or some other long-lasting effects. Yes, on the European Union level, some changes are being made last year, and some of them are coming up in the future, but it will take some time. And I think it's important to keep understanding that we do need to go through this process till the end in order, if God forbid, some sort of similar situation happens in some other country, we are more prepared to face it. Just to mention some of the things that we are from Ukrainian side are hoping to get out of it. It's like developing a confiscation process, such as things as non-conviction based confiscation and development of unexplained wills orders, for example, mechanism, or even criminalization of sanctions evasions. All those things, even though been discussed heavily in a lot of countries, are still don't have unified approach even within the European Union countries or the neighbors of European Union. And hopefully they will be addressed in the near future. I would also like to point out that we are fortunate in Ukraine to have a very vibrant and very diverse civil society. And it was even before the war, and there were a lot of organizations that are not only doing the watchdogging functions, but even for a long time, we as NGOs did actually some work for the state. We were heavily involved in drafting legislation. We were heavily involved in monitoring implementation of this legislation, of creation of the institutions I mentioned already today, high anti-corruption institutions. So for Ukraine, it would be nice at some point to reach that level where civil society can actually perform mostly a watchdogging function instead of helping the state directly to perform its functions. But that, I think, to some degree helped us, I mean, civil society and Ukraine as a country in general, to be prepared for what we have now. I have to say that even though the full-fledged war is ongoing and there is risks to the lives of everyone staying within Ukraine, civil society is still active. Civil society is still heavily participating in anti-corruption reforms and in anti-corruption movements in different areas. And civil society is being listened to, sometimes willingly, sometimes through some incentive from our side by the top officials, by the state institutions, and being included in the process. Of course, this is not a completely positive picture, because through the limitations of war, a lot of public available data was closed. Some of it being returned back, being public, but only to some degree. For example, in Ukraine, we had this asset declaration system where all the asset declarations by public officials are being available online and everyone can monitor, analyze them. Now this register is closed, and obviously we as civil society and my organization, Transparency International Ukraine, we don't see anymore the reason for such drastic measures, which limits our ability to perform even our watchdogging, for example, functions, and obviously the ability of state agencies to perform financial monitoring of asset declarations of public officials. So we have, basically what I'm trying to say is we have a lot of things to do because of the war, but also in addition to keep moving forward the anti-corruption reform that been happening before the 24th of February. Just to summarize my points, I'm very happy that through our horrible events that is happening in my country, finally the world is remembering more actively about Ukraine, about learning more what we achieved, not only when it comes to the fighting corruption, but also progress in a lot of other areas. And it definitely helps for us to keep fighting against, to preserve our identity, to preserve our independence. And it definitely does not stop us working on developing our state. It doesn't stop our movements towards more democratic and open society. The trick is, in my opinion, to keep this balance between military necessity, between the needs of war, and the necessity to keep working on the reforms that already has been started, and not only be able to preserve them through the war, but also move forward in order when we finally win, we don't need to start from the beginning. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Kateryna. I think it was great. I had some questions, but I think you answered most of them. We covered most of the topics, and I hope you could stay with us for the discussion later on. If there are any burning questions now, I would ask them, but I would rather have you later on. If you could stay, I know the situation is.
I would be happy to. So as long as there is no air tax, we are fine.
Hopefully not. And again, thanks a lot for taking the time. And I do think that there will be a lot of work in a post-war economy, and of course that's one of the prerequisites for concentration of power. It's natural in a war economy, but then dismantling that will be up to the task of the civil society. And we of course hope that we'll be working together, both learning from your experience. I do think that there's been tremendous progress in Ukraine in terms of developing different database instruments, the ones that we as our regional platform for anti-corruption here in the Balkans, we're trying to develop, in the use of big data, for anti-corruption. But I will now like to turn the floor to Olena Kupina, who is a lawyer or analyst from the Institute of Legislative Ideas in Ukraine. She was also at some point legal advisor at the Kharkiv Local Government Development Center. I hope we have a link now with Olena. Olena, it's great to have you here with us. Thank you so much for being with us, and we look forward to your presentation. Olena?
Hello. Thank you for invitation. I'm really happy to be here and represent some statements from Ukrainian civil society. And as I'm switching from Ukraine, I would like to apologize in advance for some possible problems with internet, because now the electricity is not stable, and we are always in the risk of air alarms and missile attacks. At the Institute of Legislative Ideas, we are hard working on providing analytical assistance on transparent and accountable Ukraine's recovery process for parliament, government, our policymakers, national and local authorities. So we are working both on national and local levels. We are carrying out independent assessment of draft laws, and we are conducting analytical research on that topic. So I will speak from that background, from that point of view. Also, we are the member of Ryzhenko coalition, and it's a coalition of more than 40 NGOs. We are working on Ukraine's reconstruction, integrity, sustainability, and efficiency. And it's a really strong community. We have partnership with a lot of our government bodies, and the main principle, one of the main principles of our partnership is not to shame and blame them, but to participate, sharing expertise, and so on. So I would like to start by outlining some current situation in the field of anti-corruption and the role of civil society in it. And first point would be about some progress, and then about some rollback. As already Kateryna mentioned, we are still doing our progress in anti-corruption, and one of the EU recommendations for be granted candidate status is a further strengthening of the fight against corruption. And there was some recommendation for appointed a new head for specialized anti-corruption prosecutor's office, and appointment of the director of National Anti-Corruption Bureau of Ukraine. And we are doing this even despite of war. Also, the parliament has adopted anti-corruption strategy till 2025, and now we are working on a state program on implementation of this strategy. So why I'm talking about that, it's my answer to the question, what the international partners do well. Because, some of the changes that wasn't done by years before the war. But now, sometimes political will for certain changes appears among officials after, throwing a recommendation of our foreign partners. So for Ukrainian civil society, it's crucially important to participate not only with our government, not only with our officials, but also with international partners, because we can be in
it seems we got a
this
connection
area.
issue. Okay. Yeah, Olena, sorry. I mean, there was just a brief connection issue, but please continue.
Sorry. And for that example that already mentioned about that corruption scandal of Vasyl Lozinsky, with the Deputy Minister of Communities, Territories and Infrastructure Development of Ukraine. And I would like to underline that it's not only about working our anti-corruption institution, but it's also about that we see strong political will to combat corruption. So as Vasyl Lozinsky was dismissed immediately after that scandal. It not was, like common practice in Ukraine, but we see some positive changes now when society wait, that justify. Talking about rollbacks, as Kateryna already mentioned, we have a lot of restrictions, and it's hard to be as much effective in that monitoring and inflation tools as we were before the war. And as we have some additional challenges in the that anti-corruption field, not like only ordinary country, but there is a big recovery, rebuilding, reconstruction in our country. So after the war, it's always the risk of corruptions are higher and higher. And for a better understanding in which situation Ukrainian civil society now, I will share some points. From the beginning of full-scale invasion, more than 100 public registers have been closed. We can find information about declaration of officials, the register of corrupt persons, the Unified State Register of Legal Entities, data related to the ecology, and so on and so forth. And I believe we should change this approach, and only those data related to the security and defense should be closed for the period of martial law. Because without open data, lack of civil control and accountability of authorities can lead to overspending of rebuilt funds and inefficient use. We believe that for this process, we should use one main principle: everyone see everything, and it doesn't matter what source of finding would be or who would be the entities that do this reconstruction. Everyone should see full information in the digital reconstruction management system. The same situation with publication, other types of public information, like a lot of self-government does not publish the draft of their decision, information about session, details about recovery process, partnership, and so on. But it's crucially important to monitor and watchdog that level, because the vast majority of the ruined objects are in administration of local self-governments. So we should put attention not only at the national level, not only on the minister, but also on a local government, city administration. Speaking from that point, what we think should be useful for Ukraine civil society, and what we can do better, and what we want to point it out. First, we think we must remember that the fight against corruption is the matter of a national security. After our victory, many processes will take place at the same time, funds be used from different sources, according to different procedures, on the different levels, and on all territory of Ukraine, because not only the territories that near Russian have a lot of restriction, but all of Ukraine because of rockets. We must understand that none of international partners could do it instead of us, and we think that what is really important is capacity building of local NGOs, that active citizens who are on the ground, who are living in affected settlements and communities, who will be able to most effective control the process, because they will see it by their eyes what going on there. And the second one point is that I'm with all my heart with what Kateryna said about it, that civil society should be not only a watchdog, but also a reliable partner for government, local self-government officials. It's time to come together and look for common ground, help with expertise, support anti-corruption efforts, and the price we pay is too high. So we must do everything for our victory, not only on the battlefield, but with good governance in our country. Thank you.
Thank you, Olena. Indeed, it's been great. What you both mentioned, and I really thank you for being with us. The connection is not really good, but I do hope that soon we can have you both over here, and we could come, of course, to Ukraine and work together with you. It's critically important that you mentioned the 100 registers or so. I do believe this is a great tool for transparency and for accountability, and of course for working directly to expose any ill-gotten riches, any illicit finance. And in the end of the day, as I mentioned, it is about the national security of the country. Please stay online if you can. Again, we understand and we have another 40-ish minutes of our panel, and we'll have, of course, the closing keynote from Daniel Freund. We are all with you. I mean, in a way, we hope that you could continue your important work in Ukraine, and of course, if we could be of any help, that would be great. Now, it is my pleasure to turn the floor to Ambassador Gudrun Steinacker. She knows the region intimately. She's been a great friend throughout the years. She was in Bulgaria, in Sofia. She was in Podgorica. She was before that in Skopje. She is currently with the German Association for South East Europe. She was also posted in Novosibirsk in central Novosibirsk in central Russia and Moscow. So you have a great perspective, Ambassador Steinacker, and thank you for joining us today. From your so many years of experience, what do you think is that we could do from the current point of view? And I know that we've spoken so much. You still know the local oligarchs, the setup, and and you've been also with the Diplomatic Academy in Berlin, so you've been training German diplomats and what they could help to build better here. So the floor is yours. And you're always a straight talker, so we appreciate that a lot.
Thank you very much. I would first of all really thank for the opportunity to be here, to attend this panel, and it was really very important to follow all the debates, and I got a lot of new information and new ideas. Maybe I may correct you a little bit. I was not involved in the training of German diplomats. I was involved in the training of diplomats from the Western Balkans as a retired ambassador for a couple of years.
Even better.
And yes, and that was a great pleasure. It is, of course, difficult to speak now after the two Ukrainian representatives. Their situation is so unique, and although I only know Ukraine from some travels, I know Russia quite well. It is breaking my heart what is going on there. It is so terrible, and at the same time now they have nevertheless to continue the fight against corruption and the fight against some kind of state capture. Although what I understood when I visited Ukraine the last time in 2017, there is some kind of plurality of different powers, oligarchs, and really civil society getting ever stronger and really contributing to change this country. There is a civil society and there is a strong wish for democracy and rule of law. But this wish for democracy and rule of law is the same here in the Western Balkans, but nevertheless, the picture which I have to describe now is not so positive. I left the region in 2016, but I found in the internet while doing some research for this conference a paper from last year. It was published last year by a young author, and I found it quite interesting and revealing. And it's called Whitewashing State Capture, Discursive Practices in the Western Balkans, by actually a Serbian lady, Ana Marjanović Rudan. And she describes some of the projects which I saw and went through when I was in the Balkans. The Skopje 2014 project by the then ruling Vimero party in now North Macedonia, which was highly corrupt, and there was a lot of whitewashing around it. And actually, when then this government came to an end through dirty campaigns which they had been leading, listening, large-scale listening of their opponents and of civil society. It was the EU who spoke or wrote for the first time in its report about state capture. But nevertheless, the Prime Minister of that country, as it was already mentioned today, is sitting as a political refugee in an EU country and sending his Twitter messages out. And I understood that the head of his party was just here in Serbia and supporting the, in my view, very questionable Open Balkans project. So things are still going on. And in the case of Montenegro, where I have been, was an ambassador a couple of years ago, my last 2 years in the service, this lady mentions the motorway built with the Chinese, 42 kilometers. We used to say, actually the then ambassador as a head of the EU delegation used this expression, from nowhere to nowhere. And finally, these 42 kilometers were built. They cost an enormous amount of money. We all knew from the beginning that it was terribly corrupt, and I was a little bit disappointed about the wording of the EU in its annual report. They would just mention that this project may lead to over-debting of the country, and we knew that knew exactly who would put money from that project in the pockets, and there was very little open opposition from the EU and from EU countries regarding this project. They would just express some concern. And as we see now, it was finally opened last year, and only some 40 kilometers behind the end of this motorway. By the way, they found out only quite late after it that they missed the connecting road to the normal road going into the direction of Belgrade. So they had to construct that with their own money in addition. And now a part of the road near about 40 kilometers after the end of this motorway piece collapsed, and right now it's not possible to drive freely from Podgorica to the Serbian border. So these are just two examples to tell you that I think that state capture is about primarily one thing. It's about money. And it's money, it's for the state capturers to become rich. And why do they want to become rich? They want to become rich to stay in power, to rig elections, and to stay in power, and to become even richer, and in the very end, they at least hope that they can buy impunity. And I again can give some examples, or at least one example, to say what impunity means. It is that the still president of Montenegro, until now, could buy this impunity. He had to sacrifice an old friend in 2015. It was the deputy head of the party and At that time, he was by the way, the former president of the Union Serbia Montenegro from 2003 to 2006, Svetozar Markovic. As he was sentenced, I can say this, he actually was sacrificed for the accession. For the accession to the EU, and has been living in Belgrade since. And he is not a poor man, by the way. It was known already through media research, through civil society, that there were quite a good amount of money on Swiss accounts, and I guess that's what he is living from now. The confiscation of assets was very weak. Right now it's again a topic in the media in Montenegro, and which shows that actually until now there was hardly any asset confiscation. This just gives you a picture for one country, or two countries, but the picture is not much brighter if I think of Bosnia, where the elections obviously in Republika Srpska were rigged. My friends in Bosnia tell me that Dodik in no way was elected. He lost the elections, but it was so rigged that he could stay in power, and what for, everybody knows. I just met Bosnian friends, and we talked about the politicians of the region becoming very rich, and I mentioned Milo Djukanovic and said, oh, don't know how much Mr. Dodik is owning. Of course, this is only chatting and guessing, but there is some reality behind it. And therefore, I think state capture, money to be rich as a politician is a key question, and we have to start to talk openly about it. And about, that is a very important topic for me, the complicity of individuals, of companies, of politicians, of parties. I see what is going on in these two party associations, the conservative ones, the European People's Party, and I could give concrete examples, but I don't want to, as well as the Party of the European Socialists. The head of the Party of the European Socialists, excuse me, you know it very well, has been for 10 years the former Prime Minister of Bulgaria, whom I met a couple of times personally. And I hear he lives in Zurich. He is a millionaire, what from? And has been a member of the European Parliament for many years. But how does it come that a man, and we can prove it, there are concrete cases, who was personally corrupt, can be the head of the European Socialists for 10 years? Nobody could answer this question to me until now. And that is just, I will come to the end. That is something we have to tackle. We have to speaking clearly, and we have to name and to blame and to shame. I understand that this is more difficult now in a terrible situation in Ukraine with the war, where the first task is to win the war and to be a free country, a democratic country, but without rule of law. Or I would like to use even a little bit the German word Rechtsstaat, which is a little bit going beyond rule of law. The laws are not so bad, as you said. It's absolutely true. By the time all these countries, particularly Serbia and Montenegro, which are in the process to access the EU, which are having EU accession talks, the laws are not so bad. But the implementation of the laws is simply lousy, and we know why. Because those at the very top, and there are many cronies which they have throughout the countries, are not interested in it. A typical feature, which was also mentioned during the day, is that all these countries, also EU countries, have a huge administrative core. The administration is far too big for the country, and in addition, inefficient and corrupt, as not all of them, but many. And why do they need them? Because they are actually the base of the parties, and the employees are those who support and uphold the regime. They know in the case of a change they may lose it. So we have to be more clear, more open, name and shame and blame, and ask for implementation and consequences. It is not enough if just one politician, like in the case of Svetozar Marovic, is sacrificed for the accession to NATO, or Mr. Sanader for the accession to the EU. Not that they are innocent, of course not. I do not regret what happened to them, but they are only one. And we need to get to, in the very end, all of them, and we have to stop complicity. Complicity by Western companies, Western politicians, and this is going much further, and I will finish with this. I'm just right now doing some investigation. In the case which is actually finished, it is about the bank Hypo Alpe Adria. This was a huge scandal. And Serbia was involved, Croatia was involved, actually all the countries of the region were involved. But it was an Austrian bank with German participation, and Liechtenstein actually is mentioned very often, like Malta or Cyprus. And so it is a system, and these are problems we have to tackle, and we have to, yes, first to name, but then we have also to change something also within the EU. I just mentioned that Mr. Gruevski is a refugee in Hungary. So we all know what the situation in Hungary is about. As I have relatives in Hungary, I get some real inside information. That doesn't mean that Mr. Orban does not have the support of a considerable part of the population, but that cannot be the criterion. The criterion must be rule of law, must be real democracy. And so that is a task I would like to hand over to the EU, to the EU member states. I'm belonging to it. And we cannot only blame the situation to the citizens here in these countries. They are the least ones who can do something about it. They are protesting, they are going on the road. But what happened in Bosnia a couple of years ago? The people went on the street, they were fighting, and everybody was saying, oh great, now something will happen. Nothing happened. The situation now in Bosnia is worse than these years ago. So I will finish with this. I hope this conference, which is fantastic, has been fantastic, will be a further incentive to tackle really state capture and as a consequence of state capture or symptom of state capture, corruption, for the benefit of the people.
Thank you, Ambassador Steinacke. We still have 20 minutes for discussion, and I'm happy to open it to the lively audience. I can see people.
This is really interesting. You know, read this.
Trying to not burst in questions, but I have my own
Very
questions if they're not coming up. What Ambassador Steinacke, and do help me if I've not seen any hands. But what you mentioned about state capture and about following the money, it's been, there's been lots of initiatives, and I'd like to put this to all three of you, and also to our online participants if they want to add something. And I don't know if we're following anything that's happening on Zoom, but if there are any questions there, do please also let me know. The question is, how do we tip the things further? There seems to be this understanding that and with the war in Ukraine, this has made it even worse. There are orders of priority, and as you mentioned, Gudrun, first order of priority is win the war. Okay. But we also need, as our Ukrainian friends told us, we need to keep the balance. We still need to be aware that we need to have our country in a democratic state after this war ends. And the question is, looking at the Western Balkans and looking at all the first, again, positive developments. I don't have, there's been so many. The Ambassador Hill this morning mentioned 400 million. invested by the US in rule of law reports.
And
the EU has invested much more than that, you know, throughout the years. And you mentioned this report about the European Court of Auditors, that it said that the return on investment on rule of law, and again, I agree with Ambassador Hill that we probably don't want to go in a very accountant way of looking into rule of law return on investment, because this is a longer term issue that we need to consider. But also there have been reports that the conditionality, the enforcement of conditionalities of the EU, although they've multiplied, they've become more specific and bureaucratic, they've not been enforced that strictly as with previous accessions. And the question to you is, I guess, what would be your expectations to change with the next EU anti-corruption package that's being prepared? The EU now has also its democracy action plan. We also have our EU rule of law mechanism and reports, to which Hungary, which is in Southeast Europe, and again I want to emphasize we're talking about the whole region. I mean, we've been a real laboratory for anti-corruption work. You know, Hungary is the first country to get in the EU rule of law mechanism. Bulgaria and Romania have been under special oversight with the cooperation verification mechanism. We've had 3 iterations of the enlargement framework for the Western Balkans, you know, trying to introduce these conditionalities, but in the end of the day, it's about spurring this political will. What can we do to go there? And to Milena particularly, do you think that we might use the Summit for Democracy? There is now these anti-corruption cohorts, including 2 in our region. One is, to my great surprise, but delight, was initiated by the Bulgarian government, and I'm our justice minister. So how can we use this, you know, sprouts of change? The other one comes from Moldova, and it's co-chaired by Transparency International and the Basel Institute of Governance. So the question is, maybe starting back with Dirk, what is it? How can we leverage these kind of big-time political statements and go back to our initial statement of delivering on the European rule of law promise, or going back to also what we've worked with the US is building a democracy that delivers? Because what we've seen across the region has been dampening of, actually not just across the region, but also in the EU, there's been dampening of readiness or willingness to join the EU, and the same thing on both sides, you know, in the EU, but also in the Western Balkans. How can we change this? Dirk, you have yeah.
Thank you, Ruslan, for the questions. And now happened what usually happens at all panels, and that is, to which I participate, and that is that the EU is either doing too little or too much. This time is a panel too little. If we had other representatives here from the authorities, it would certainly be too much. And since you mentioned Moldova, I also remembered you may posting there the complaints we received frequently, that we are even without a European perspective, we were asking them more than we were asking the Western Balkan states countries in terms of reform, in particular on rule of law and the fight against corruption. So there are people, I think, who would challenge your view that the EU conditionality is being weakened. And that I would also mention in relation to Ukraine, where we have this huge MFA Plus program, multi-billion program, where I think we have strict conditionality, in particular also on the fight against corruption. And we will see how this will be implemented, as this is a program which is being rolled out as we speak. When it comes to the impact of joining the European Union, the public perception, yes, the trend is downwards. Or let's say the trend was very much downwards in Serbia after the 24th of February, but it's getting slightly better again when we look at our figures, even though the figures are still worse than they were before the 24th of February. But that, I think, has nothing to do with the fight against corruption. That has to do with a media environment which is marked by tabloids and disinformation. So when it comes to the support to EU accession, I'm not sure if the European Union delegation is necessarily the only or the right or main addressee of these questions. I would put forward the argument that there might be others to whom one should speak about that as well. And in other parts of the Western Balkans, I think the figures look better. And even in Serbia, if the question was referendum tomorrow, joining the EU, yes or no, the referendum would pass. But of course, our ambition is not to pass a referendum with 50+1 votes. That's not what we want. We want the whole society to be behind the EU accession. And there, that certain link, of course, is also with what I mentioned at the beginning, the credibility of the enlargement perspective, where we really have to pass the message, we want Serbia, but also for that we need to see reforms. So it's not one-sided, but the main issue I would say is the information or disinformation environment, where you have tabloids arguing that Ukraine attacked Russia, not the other way around. And on the questions of sanctions, and yes, we have the State of the Union of von der Leyen 2022, when she spoke about the anti-corruption package. We have the defense of democracy package, which you mentioned. By the way, the consultation is ongoing on the communication and the proposal for a directive. Deadline, I think, is 17th of February. So invite everybody here in the room and listening on Zoom to provide contributions, making proposals to rectify what you might think is not going well, also within the European Union. And indeed, the situation in some of our member states might be one of the reasons why we're paying so much attention to rule of law, because if we enlarge our union, we want to have it based on a strong rule of law. And on the sanctions, corruption, of course, the European sanctions regime is rather young. It's developing. We have the human rights sanctions, we have the chemical weapons sanctions, and there, of course, there's lots of debate around, in particular, the human rights sanctions regime, whether or not this should also address corruption. But as we all know, in the end, we need also consensus for our sanctions regime within the European Union. But let's also see what will be the outcome of the public consultation. And last but not least, I think we are all aware, as it was mentioned in the panel, that the investigation and prosecution of cross-border corruption is necessary, and that the cross-border corruption also is a tool for foreign interference in democratic processes. I think also within the European Union, the last few weeks, we have experienced that as well.
That's great, thank you. No, I do believe that, I made this clear, but I do believe that the EU is the force for good in this region, and I think we should be very thankful, both member states and the whole neighborhood, for the great job that the EU actually has been doing, because I could see the great difference that we have in new member states like Bulgaria, Romania, and Hungary and Croatia. For example, in our research on asset declarations or on public procurement, the level of transparency is at a completely different, it's completely different level indeed. Given the very much technical support that these countries receive from the European Commission, and also from the experience of other countries, including USA, for example. They started the public procurement or registry reforms in many of the countries, and then the EU took it to perfection. That's why now, if you look at all the investigative stories that you see within the countries in Southeast Europe that are a member of the EU, it's much easier to actually pinpoint where the weak spots are and do investigations. But then comes the prosecution, and that already requires a completely different level of evidence. And it will be also it will be interesting. I don't know if Milena, you know of any initiative for USA to support this drive towards Summit for Democracy, Anti-Corruption action. You know, I know that I met the Global Anti-Corruption Coordinator, Matthew Nephews, in the State Department. You know, and it seems that there is some thinking about in that direction, but will it benefit also the Western Balkans? Again, I'm going back to these regional initiatives that I think we're doing a great job, and the EU has stepped in a lot. I mean, actually, SELDI has been supported ever since 2012 by DG NEAR, and we've received a lot of support in that direction too. But is there anything in the pipeline that we might be looking at?
Yes. As you know, there is a second Summit for Democracy scheduled for end of March, in a way to report on what happened in, again, so-called year of action, which was the previous year. I would say that maybe one concrete example of the Summit for Democracy, the first Summit for Democracy success, well, yet to be seen, but there is an action at least. So USAID launched a regional program that involves countries from Western Balkans, Eastern Partnership and Central Europe. It's a project of 5 years, and it's about investigative journalism. Building networks, enhancing networks, building future generations of investigative journalists, basically helping them survive. So that is one example of, concrete example of what is happening. Again, the project was just launched, I think, in November of 2022, so it's very early to talk about any concrete successes of it. But just the fact that we are expanding network of very important part of media, the most important part of media when it comes to fight against corruption, when it comes to preserving democracies, when it comes to nurturing rule of law, that is definitely investigative journalism. In Serbia, what we have is maybe investigative media is in kind of, let's say, even in a good shape in terms of in comparison with other media that we have here in Serbia. But we definitely have here, and I was happy to hear about Ukrainian colleagues that they mentioned how vibrant civil society is in Ukraine, even despite the circumstances they live right now. We don't have that in Serbia. You mentioned the window of opportunity after the war ends. It's very short, and we can talk about that from Serbian experience. So from 2001, we had a couple of years of this optimism, sort of looking at the EU accession as something that will happen quicker, faster. We all thought that by now we would all be in EU, right? So here now we have a fatigue among citizens, among civil society. Very few civil society organizations are actually seriously following government, performing watchdog role. And we need to support them. And we will support them through our current program related to public procurement. We will work with civil society. But yes, more needs to be done. The civil society here just a little bit woke up a little bit during the constitutional amendments process. That kind of woke them up, but then again, it's a very specific topic, and usually more or less legal professional associations were involved in this process, took part or refused to take part, but other organizations, especially outside of Belgrade, are facing shrinking space, and on the other hand, looking at the EU, we also see, as we see it in this country, rising of autocracy systems. And if we see it in EU countries such as Hungary or Poland or even Greece, and some other are trending into autocracies, it's hard to kind of stay optimistic about EU accession in this state of play. And when it comes to what US can do, soft power. We don't have a stick. US doesn't have a stick. EU does. So we kind of look at EU for the stick. We try to offer carrot. So I want to say, yes, soft power is something that I think US can contribute to moving Serbia a little bit closer to EU, a little bit faster.
I can assure you a lot of people think that the US has the biggest stick in the Western democracies, but that's a different long topic. Gudrun, several last words, and we are like 2 or 3 minutes away from hearing from Daniel Freund, who, and again, I want to thank Kateryna and Milena for being with us and for staying on the panel, and I look forward to really working with them. And getting back to conditionalities and going back to our dear Prime Minister and head of the European Socialists, this is when actually European anti-corruption conditionalities worked. In the case of Bulgaria, I've seen it work a number of times. One was when Bulgaria got into the EU, and we thought that's the end of it. You know, we can now unleash all our, primal instincts. But a year later, the EU already froze all its accession funds, and there wasn't in 2000, and there wasn't even a mechanism for that. They just said, well, it happened to be in the same day when we released our first report on under the cooperation verification mechanism. It happened that we also found out that we stopped all the funds. So this led to a change. This led to the appointment of the first EU Minister of Management of EU funds. That was one. And then until 2010, when there was a precautionary clause, big stick, because you could get, they could get your vote from the Council of the EU, but at the same time also big carrots. Bulgaria had the biggest, the largest anti-corruption program ever in its history with EU funds. But once 2011 came and this precautionary clause elapsed, the stick was away, the money was taken away, and there you go. Then we have almost 12 years with a lot of technical work on anti-corruption, but no political will. And I can see this all across the Western Balkans.
Yes, exactly.
I can see this in every single country. So what, in one sentence, is there anything that we could learn from that? Is there anything, can we help get this stick and carrot back? Because it's, one thing is, yes, we get the conditionalities for, and that everybody tries to weaken the conditionality. Nobody likes conditionalities, but they should work. This is how we learn the rules. But secondly, the carrot, I'm not sure there are enough carrots out there in terms of technical capacity building, like we used to have in the first accession waves in 2004. 1 minute, please, yes, and then we will turn also to Daniel Freund.
Yeah, two things. I think, first of all, it is important to be outspoken, to say if the carrots do not work. And there the EU is very hesitant. We have used diplomatic speech, and that is not sufficient, particularly not with regard also to the civil society. And I think this is something the European Court of Auditors said already in another report a couple of years ago, that there is not enough sufficient, with all the projects for supporting civil society, it is insufficient in comparison to what we give to the ruling elites and which they can embezzle and work with. And there has to be a change, a different attitude. The EU is not only the political level, it is also the civil society. And the civil society is there. Even if it's right now weak in Serbia, in other countries it goes up and down, like what Mr. Bunhout this morning said, with the whole process. And there I expect that the EU is more honest, also with regard to the deficits within the EU, and more outspoken, even if this is not diplomatic, and support civil society.
Kateryna, I think this is a wonderful full stop of our panel. Thank you so much. Thanks also to our Ukrainian panelists.